Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into a world that existed long before cities, before agriculture, before written language. We're going back 3 million years to witness something extraordinary. A time when survival wasn't guaranteed by the swipe of a card or the flip of a switch, but by raw intelligence, unbreakable teamwork, and the kind of courage that would make modern extreme sports look like a casual stroll through the park. Picture this. You're standing on the African savanna as the sun begins to set, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. The air is thick with tension because somewhere in the distance, a massive woolly mammoth standing 12 feet tall and weighing 8 tons is grazing peacefully. But you and your small band of early humans are about to attempt something that should be impossible. You're going to bring down this giant using nothing but stone tools, wooden spears, and a plan that requires perfect coordination. One mistake, and you're not just going home empty-handed. You're not going home at all. If you're enjoying these deep dives into our ancient past, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button or even subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells me you want to see more of these stories from our incredible human journey. I'm always curious about where you're all watching from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. There's something magical about knowing we're all connected across the globe, sharing these glimpses into our shared ancestry. Now settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's journey back to a time when every day was a test of survival, and when hunting a mammoth wasn't just about getting food. It was about proving that intelligence could triumph over raw power, that cooperation could overcome impossible odds, and that our ancestors possessed a kind of strategic thinking that would lay the foundation for everything humans would eventually become. The world 3 million years ago was nothing like the planet we know today. Forget everything you think you understand about early human life. This wasn't some primitive existence of grunting cave dwellers stumbling around with clubs. These were sophisticated beings with complex social structures, advanced problem-solving abilities, and hunting techniques so ingenious they would impress modern military strategists. The landscape itself was dramatically different. Where we see cities and farmland today, vast grasslands stretched to every horizon. The climate was cooler. The ice ages were coming and going in cycles that lasted thousands of years, and massive creatures roamed the earth. We're talking about saber-toothed cats with fangs the size of kitchen knives, cave bears that could crush a human skull with one swipe. And yes, those legendary woolly mammoths that stood as tall as modern elephants, but were covered in thick, shaggy fur, designed to survive the harshest winters imaginable. But here's what's truly remarkable. In this world of giants and predators, early humans weren't cowering in caves. They were apex hunters. They had figured out something that no other species had managed. They could work together in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities exponentially. A single human might be no match for a mammoth, but 10 humans with a plan. That changed everything. The early humans of this era weren't the stooped, primitive figures you might imagine from old textbooks. Archaeological evidence shows us they were physically impressive specimens. They had to be. Their daily survival depended on covering vast distances on foot, carrying heavy loads, and engaging in physically demanding activities that would exhaust a modern athlete. Their muscle density was extraordinary, their endurance was legendary, and their sensory awareness was finely tuned to detect the smallest changes in their environment. Their brains were smaller than ours, yes, but don't let that fool you. These were incredibly intelligent beings who had developed sophisticated tool-making techniques, complex communication systems, and hunting strategies that required long-term planning, detailed environmental knowledge, and split-second decision-making under the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. They lived in small groups, usually between 20 and 30 individuals, and these weren't random collections of people. These were carefully structured communities where everyone had a specific role, where knowledge was passed down through generations, and where the survival of the group depended on each member understanding their part in elaborate cooperative ventures. The mammoth hunt wasn't something they attempted lightly. This was the ultimate test of their abilities, requiring months of preparation, detailed reconnaissance, and a level of coordination that would challenge even modern special forces teams. But when they succeeded, the rewards were enormous. A single mammoth could provide meat for weeks, hide for shelter and clothing, bones for tools and weapons, and fat for fuel and waterproofing. It was like winning the ancient lottery, except the price of a ticket could be your life. The preparation for a mammoth hunt began long before anyone picked up a spear. These early humans were master trackers who could read the landscape like a detailed map. They understood mammoth behavior better than many modern zoologists understand elephant behavior today. They knew the migration patterns, the feeding habits, the social structures, and most importantly, the vulnerabilities. Mammoths, despite their massive size and impressive tusks, had weaknesses that could be exploited by intelligent hunters. They were social animals that protected their young and cared for their elderly. They had predictable responses to threats. They could be panicked under the right circumstances, and they had specific anatomical weak points where a well-placed spear could cause maximum damage. But knowing these weaknesses was just the beginning. The real challenge was creating opportunities to exploit them. Mammoths didn't just wander into convenient hunting situations. They had to be maneuvered, manipulated, and driven into positions where the hunters could strike effectively while minimizing their own risk. This required an understanding of terrain that went far beyond simple geography. The hunters needed to know every cliff, every ravine, every swamp, every narrow passage in their territory. They had to understand how mammoths would react to different environmental pressures and how to use the landscape itself as a weapon. The tools they used were marvels of early engineering. These weren't crude implements hastily assembled from random materials. Each spear was carefully crafted from specific types of wood chosen for their strength and flexibility. The stone points were knapped with precision that required years of training to master, shaped to penetrate thick mammoth hide and cause maximum internal damage. But perhaps most impressive were the specialized tools they developed specifically for mammoth hunting. Long-distance spears designed to be thrown from safety. Close combat weapons for the inevitable moments when the hunt turned into a life or death struggle. Cutting tools for processing the massive carcass once the hunt was successful. Each tool was perfectly adapted to its specific purpose in the complex choreography of the hunt. They also developed hunting aids that show remarkable ingenuity. Fire was used not just for warmth and cooking, but as a hunting tool. Controlled burns could drive mammoths toward waiting hunters. Torches could be used to panic the animals in darkness. Smoke could mask human scent and confuse mammoth senses. They created pit traps in strategic locations, carefully camouflaged holes that could injure or immobilize a mammoth long enough for hunters to move in for the kill. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were engineering projects that required understanding soil composition, mammoth anatomy, and the physics of a multi-ton animal falling into a trap. The social coordination required for these hunts was extraordinary. Everyone in the group had to understand the plan perfectly because there was no room for confusion when facing an 8-ton animal with tusks that could impale a human in seconds. The hunt leaders weren't just the strongest or the bravest. They were master strategists who could visualize complex scenarios, adapt to changing circumstances, and make split-second decisions that meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Communication during the hunt had to be silent and precise. They developed elaborate hand signal systems that could convey complex information across distances without alerting their prey. They understood wind patterns and how to position themselves so their scent wouldn't give them away. They knew how to move across different terrains without making noise that would spook the mammoth. The psychological preparation was just as important as the physical preparation. Hunting a mammoth required a level of courage that's hard for us to imagine. These hunters were voluntarily placing themselves in mortal danger, betting their lives on their skills, their teamwork, and their ability to execute a plan flawlessly under the most stressful conditions possible. They developed rituals and ceremonies that served multiple purposes. These practices bonded the hunting group together, reinforced their confidence in the plan, and helped manage the natural fear that any sane person would feel when preparing to face such a dangerous adversary. The psychological preparation was about transforming that fear into focused determination and absolute trust in their fellow hunters. The actual hunt typically began days before the moment of confrontation. Scouts would locate a suitable mammoth, often an older animal separated from the main herd, or a younger mammoth that had wandered too far from protection. The hunters would then begin the delicate process of maneuvering their target toward the chosen killing ground. This required incredible patience and skill. Moving too quickly or too aggressively would spook the mammoth and ruin the entire operation. The hunters had to nudge their prey gradually, using natural barriers and environmental pressures to guide the animal exactly where they wanted it, without the mammoth realizing it was being manipulated. They used fire strategically, creating controlled burns that would encourage the mammoth to move in specific directions. They used noise to create anxiety and keep the animal moving. They even used decoy tactics, with some hunters visible to the mammoth while others remained hidden, creating confusion about the true threat. The killing ground itself was chosen with surgical precision. It had to provide advantages to the hunters while limiting the mammoth's options for escape or retaliation. Ideally, it would be a location where the massive animal's size and strength became disadvantages rather than advantages. A narrow canyon where the mammoth couldn't charge effectively. A swampy area where its weight would cause it to become mired. A cliff edge where panic might cause a fatal fall. When the moment of truth finally arrived, everything had to happen with clockwork precision. The hunters would position themselves in a carefully orchestrated formation that had been practiced countless times. This wasn't a chaotic mob rushing toward their prey. This was a coordinated military operation where every person knew exactly where to be, when to move, and what role they played in bringing down the giant. The initial attack was designed to wound and weaken rather than kill immediately. The hunters understood that a mammoth in its death throes was more dangerous than a healthy one. Their strategy was to inflict injuries that would gradually sap the animal's strength, while keeping themselves out of range of those devastating tusks, and that trunk that could grab a human and dash them against the rocks like a rag doll. They targeted specific areas with surgical precision. The tendons behind the legs that, if severed, would cripple the mammoth's mobility. The soft tissue around the eyes and trunk that would cause pain and confusion. The flanks where spears could penetrate deeply and cause internal bleeding. Each strike was calculated to contribute to the overall strategy of wearing down their massive opponent. But mammoths weren't passive victims. These were intelligent animals with their own survival instincts and defensive capabilities. A wounded mammoth would trumpet in rage and pain, alerting any other mammoths in the area to the danger. It would charge with fury that could crush anyone unlucky enough to be caught in its path. It would use its trunk like a massive club, swinging it with enough force to shatter bones. Those curved tusks weren't just for show. They were weapons that could gore a human in seconds. The hunters had to be constantly moving, constantly adapting their positions as the situation evolved. What started as a carefully planned ambush could quickly become a deadly game of cat and mouse, where the slightest mistake meant death. Some hunters would engage the mammoth directly, drawing its attention and keeping it focused on immediate threats. Others would circle around to attack from blind spots, looking for opportunities to land critical strikes. The noise during these hunts must have been absolutely terrifying. The mammoth screams of rage and pain echoing across the landscape, the shouts and calls of the hunters coordinating their attacks, the sound of spears striking flesh and bone, the thunder of massive feet pounding the ground as the wounded animal tried to escape or retaliate. Blood would be everywhere. The mammoth's thick hide was tough, but once the spears began finding their marks, the bleeding would start. The hunters themselves weren't immune to injury. Flying debris, glancing blows from the mammoth's trunk, falls while dodging charges, cuts from their own weapons in the chaos of combat. This wasn't a clean, surgical operation. It was brutal, messy, and dangerous beyond imagination. The endgame of a mammoth hunt could last hours. These massive animals had incredible endurance and an enormous will to live. Even severely wounded, a mammoth could continue fighting long after a smaller animal would have collapsed. The hunters had to maintain their coordination and discipline even as exhaustion set in, even as their adrenaline began to fade, even as the reality of what they were attempting began to sink in. Sometimes the mammoth would make a final, desperate attempt to escape, crashing through the hunting formation and heading for open ground, where its size and speed would give it advantages. The hunters had contingency plans for this scenario too. Fresh runners would take up the pursuit, while the initial attack team caught their breath. The wounded animal would be tracked relentlessly until blood loss and exhaustion finally brought it down. The moment when a mammoth finally fell was both triumphant and sobering. The immediate danger was over, but the work was just beginning. A dead mammoth represented an enormous logistical challenge. 8 tons of meat, hide, and bone had to be processed quickly before scavengers arrived or the meat began to spoil. But before the practical work began, there were rituals to observe. These early humans understood that they had just taken the life of a magnificent creature, and that act required acknowledgement and respect. They had ceremonies that honored the mammoth spirit, that gave thanks for the successful hunt, and that reinforced the bonds between the hunters who had risked everything together. The processing of a mammoth carcass was a community effort that could take days. Everyone had specialized skills and specific responsibilities. The hunters who had made the kill weren't necessarily the same people who were expert butchers. There were specialists who knew exactly how to skin the massive hide in one piece, preserving it for use as shelter material. Others who understood mammoth anatomy well enough to extract the choice cuts of meat efficiently. The hide alone was incredibly valuable. Mammoth skin was thick enough to provide excellent protection from the elements, but flexible enough to be worked into clothing, shelter walls, and storage containers. The fur could be separated and used for insulation. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant death in a world where resources were scarce, and the next successful hunt was never guaranteed. The bones were treasure troves of raw materials. Mammoth ribs could be shaped into tent poles. The skull could be converted into a shelter foundation. Smaller bones became tools, needles, and weapons. The tusks were perhaps the most prized materials of all. Ivory that could be carved into specialized tools, ceremonial objects, and trade goods that could be exchanged with other human groups across vast distances. The fat was liquid gold in the ancient world. Mammoth fat could be rendered into fuel for lamps, waterproofing for clothing and shelters, and a high-calorie food source that could sustain hunters through lean periods. It could be mixed with other materials to create adhesives and preservatives. A single mammoth could provide enough fat to keep a community supplied for months, but perhaps most importantly, the meat represented survival itself. 8 tons of protein could feed a group of 30 people for weeks if properly preserved. The early humans had developed sophisticated techniques for drying, smoking, and storing meat that allowed them to create food reserves for times when hunting was unsuccessful or weather-made foraging impossible. The success of a mammoth hunt rippled through the entire community in ways that went far beyond simple nutrition. Young hunters gained status and experience. Children learned by watching the master butchers and tool makers work. Knowledge was passed down about mammoth behavior, hunting techniques, and processing methods that would be crucial for future hunts. These successful hunts also created opportunities for trade and social interaction with other human groups. Word of a mammoth kill would spread across the region, and other communities would arrive to trade for meat, hide, and bones. These gatherings were vital for sharing information about game movements, weather patterns, new tool-making techniques, and for the young people to meet potential mates from other groups. The psychological impact of successfully hunting a mammoth cannot be overstated. These early humans had just demonstrated that intelligence and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. They had proven that careful planning, specialized knowledge, and coordinated teamwork could bring down an animal 40 times their size. This wasn't just about food or materials. This was about establishing humanity's place in a dangerous world filled with predators and competitors. The confidence gained from mammoth hunting influenced every other aspect of their lives. If they could bring down a mammoth, they could handle other challenges too. Territorial disputes with rival human groups, severe weather that threatened their survival, resource shortages that required innovation and adaptation. The mammoth hunt was a proving ground that prepared them for everything else life could throw at them. The skills developed for mammoth hunting transferred to other aspects of survival as well. The ability to track and predict animal behavior helped with hunting smaller game. The coordination and communication skills improved their ability to work together on other projects like building shelters or defending their territory. The tool-making expertise led to innovations in other areas of technology. The weapons and techniques pioneered for mammoth hunting influenced the development of warfare between human groups. The same spear-throwing skills that could bring down a mammoth could be devastating in conflicts with other humans. The tactical thinking required for coordinating a mammoth hunt translated directly to military strategy and group combat situations. These mammoth hunters were also innovators who constantly refined and improved their techniques. Each successful hunt provided new information about what worked and what didn't. Failed hunts, when the hunters were lucky enough to survive them, taught valuable lessons about mammoth behavior and the limits of their current methods. They experimented with different spear designs, testing various combinations of wood types, stone points, and binding techniques. They developed new tracking methods based on close observation of mammoth sign and behavior patterns. They created better preservation techniques for meat and hide processing. Innovation wasn't just encouraged in these communities, it was essential for survival. The mammoth hunters also became master storytellers, and this wasn't just entertainment around the evening fire. These stories served as educational tools, preserving crucial hunting knowledge across generations. Every detail of a successful hunt would be memorized, analyzed, and retold countless times. The way the wind shifted just before the mammoth charged, the exact angle needed to penetrate the thick hide behind the shoulder, the sound a mammoth makes when it's truly wounded versus when it's just angry. These oral traditions created a living database of mammoth hunting wisdom that grew more sophisticated with each generation. Young hunters didn't just learn by doing, they learned by listening to detailed accounts of hunts that had happened decades before they were born. They could visualize scenarios they'd never experienced and prepare mentally for situations that might never arise, but could mean the difference between life and death if they ever did. The stories also served another crucial function. They preserved the memory of hunters who had died in the pursuit of mammoths. In a world without written language, these tales became monuments to courage and skill. A hunter's legacy lived on in the stories of his greatest hunts, his innovative techniques, his moments of heroism or tragic miscalculation. Death in a mammoth hunt wasn't meaningless. It became part of the collective wisdom that would help future hunters survive. But not every mammoth encounter ended in a successful hunt. The archaeological record is filled with evidence of hunts gone wrong. Human bones bearing the distinctive marks of mammoth tusks. partially completed tool caches abandoned when hunting parties never returned, campsites that show signs of hasty evacuation when mammoth herds move through unexpectedly. These failures taught the survivors just as much as the successes. They learned to read mammoth behavior more carefully, to identify the warning signs that a hunt was about to turn deadly. They developed escape routes and contingency plans for when everything went wrong. They created protocols for rescuing wounded hunters and for making the difficult decision to abandon a hunt when the risks became too great. The mammoth hunters also had to contend with competition from other predators. Saber-toothed cats were attracted to mammoth carcasses and weren't intimidated by human hunters. Cave bears could claim a kill and defend it successfully against an entire human hunting party. Packs of dire wolves could harass the hunters throughout the processing of a mammoth, stealing meat and creating constant danger. This led to the development of defensive hunting strategies that went far beyond simply killing the mammoth. The hunters had to secure their kill site, post sentries to watch for approaching predators, and work in shifts so that some members of the group could rest while others remained alert for threats. A successful mammoth hunt could quickly turn into a siege situation, where the humans had to defend their prize against wave after wave of scavengers and competitors. The weapons they developed for these defensive battles were different from their mammoth hunting tools. Short, stabbing spears for close combat with saber-toothed cats. Firebrands that could drive off most predators without risking human lives in direct confrontation. Noisemakers that could alert the entire group to approaching danger even in the darkness or during the chaos of butchering. They also learned to use mammoth carcasses strategically in these defensive situations. The massive body could serve as a fortress wall, providing cover from attacking predators. The bones could be quickly fashioned into barricades or defensive spears. Even the mammoth's death could be turned into a tactical advantage for the hunters who had brought it down. The seasonal timing of mammoth hunts required incredibly sophisticated understanding of natural cycles. Mammoths were easier to hunt during certain times of the year when their behavior was predictable, when weather conditions favored the hunters, and when the meat could be properly preserved. But these optimal hunting windows were often brief, sometimes lasting only a few weeks out of the entire year. This created intense pressure on hunting groups to be ready when the opportunity arose. Months of preparation could come down to a few days when all the conditions aligned perfectly. Miss that window, and the group might have to wait an entire year for another chance. The psychological pressure was enormous, knowing that the survival of 30 people might depend on executing a perfect hunt during a brief window of opportunity. The hunters developed elaborate systems for predicting these optimal hunting periods. They tracked mammoth migration patterns across multiple years, noting how weather affected movement and behavior. They observed how other prey animals reacted to changing seasons and used that information to predict mammoth responses. They even tracked the movement of other predators, understanding that competition for resources followed predictable patterns. Weather prediction became a crucial skill for mammoth hunters. A sudden storm during a hunt could scatter the human hunting party and give the mammoth opportunities to escape. Rain could make tracking impossible and turn the killing ground into treacherous terrain. Snow could provide camouflage for the hunters, but also make it harder to coordinate their attacks. They learned to read subtle signs in the sky, the behavior of birds, the direction of winds, and the feel of the air itself. This wasn't superstition. It was practical meteorology developed through generations of careful observation and hard-won experience. A hunter who could predict weather changes 3 days in advance had an enormous advantage over one who could only react to conditions as they developed. The mammoth hunters also had to consider the political implications of their hunts. A successful mammoth kill could shift the balance of power between different human groups in the region. The group that brought down a mammoth gained tremendous status and could use that success to negotiate better trading relationships, form new alliances, or even expand their territory. This led to the development of complex diplomatic protocols around mammoth hunting. Some areas were considered neutral hunting grounds, where multiple groups could operate without conflict. Others were jealously guarded territories where trespassing hunters could face violent retaliation. The most productive mammoth hunting areas became contested zones where human groups would fight each other for access rights. The weapons and tactics developed for mammoth hunting inevitably influenced human warfare as well. Hunters who could coordinate a spear attack against an 8-ton mammoth could certainly coordinate similar attacks against rival human groups. The same tactical thinking that could outmaneuver a mammoth could be applied to outflanking enemy warriors. But warfare between human groups was different from mammoth hunting in crucial ways. Humans were intelligent opponents who could adapt their tactics, set traps of their own, and develop counter-strategies. The psychological warfare became just as important as physical combat. Intimidation, deception, and alliance building could determine the outcome of conflicts before the first spear was thrown. The mammoth hunters developed sophisticated intelligence-gathering networks to monitor the activities of rival groups. They needed to know who was hunting where, which groups had been successful recently, and what new weapons or techniques were being developed by their competitors. Information was just as valuable as meat or hide in this dangerous world. Trade relationships grew directly out of mammoth hunting success. Groups that were skilled hunters could trade meat and materials for resources they couldn't obtain locally. Obsidian for better spear points, exotic furs for ceremonial purposes, salt for food preservation. These trade networks stretched across hundreds of miles and created the first truly long-distance economic relationships in human history. The mammoth hunters also became the first human specialists. While everyone in the group had basic survival skills, the demands of mammoth hunting led to the development of expert roles that required years of training to master. Master trackers who could follow mammoth sign across any terrain. Weapons specialists who could craft spears capable of penetrating mammoth hide. Tactical planners who could visualize complex hunting scenarios and adapt strategies in real time. These specialists gained status and influence within their communities that went far beyond their hunting contributions. They became teachers, advisors, and leaders whose expertise was valued in many different situations. A master tracker could find water sources during droughts. A weapons specialist could design better tools for any purpose. A tactical planner could organize community defenses against natural disasters or human threats. The knowledge these specialists possessed was too valuable to risk losing. This led to the development of formal apprenticeship systems where experienced hunters would take younger community members under their wing and pass on their specialized skills. These weren't casual teaching relationships. They were intensive training programs that could last for years and required the apprentice to demonstrate mastery of increasingly complex skills. The mammoth hunters also pushed the boundaries of human endurance and physical capability. A mammoth hunt could require traveling hundreds of miles on foot, carrying heavy equipment, and then engaging in hours of intense physical combat. The hunters had to maintain peak physical condition year-round because they never knew when a hunting opportunity might arise. They developed training regimens that prepared them for the specific demands of mammoth hunting. Endurance running to build the stamina needed for long pursuits. Spear throwing practice to maintain accuracy under pressure. Wrestling and combat training to prepare for close encounters with wounded mammoths. These weren't recreational activities. They were survival preparation that could determine whether the next hunt would be successful or fatal. The psychological preparation was just as intense as the physical training. Mammoth hunting required a level of courage that had to be cultivated and maintained through constant mental conditioning. Hunters used visualization techniques, imagining themselves successfully executing every aspect of a hunt. They developed rituals and ceremonies that built confidence and group cohesion. They told stories that reinforced the values of bravery, skill, and sacrifice that mammoth hunting demanded. But perhaps most remarkably, these early humans understood that mammoth hunting was changing them as a species. Each successful hunt proved that intelligence and cooperation could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Each innovation in hunting technique demonstrated that humans could adapt and improve their capabilities through learning and practice. Each generation of hunters was building on the knowledge of those who came before, creating an ever-growing foundation of human achievement. The mammoth hunters were essentially conducting the first great human experiment in organized technological warfare against nature itself. They were proving that a relatively weak, slow species could dominate much larger and more powerful animals through superior planning, better tools, and coordinated group action. The lessons learned from mammoth hunting would eventually be applied to every other challenge humans would face as they spread across the planet and began to reshape the world around them. The mammoth hunters weren't just surviving in their harsh world. They were actively reshaping it, and in doing so, they were reshaping themselves. Every successful hunt created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate community. Word would spread across the vast networks of human settlements, carried by traders, travelers, and migrants who moved between groups. A successful mammoth kill became currency in the ancient world's information economy. These stories weren't just entertainment or bragging rights. They were detailed technical manuals disguised as epic tales. When a hunter from one group described how his people had brought down a particularly large mammoth, listeners weren't just enjoying a good story, they were absorbing critical intelligence about new techniques, innovative weapons, and tactical approaches that could mean the difference between life and death for their own communities. The knowledge transfer worked both ways. Visiting hunters would share their own innovations, creating a constant exchange of ideas that accelerated the development of mammoth hunting techniques across entire continents. A spear design perfected in one region could spread to dozens of other communities within a few seasons. A tracking method developed on the northern plains could be adapted for use in forested regions hundreds of miles away. This technological evolution happened at a pace that would seem glacial by modern standards, but it was revolutionary for its time. Each generation of hunters inherited not just the accumulated knowledge of their immediate ancestors, but the collective wisdom of human communities scattered across thousands of square miles. The mammoth hunters were creating humanity's first global knowledge network, connected not by cables or satellites, but by the ancient bonds of survival and shared purpose. The social structures within mammoth hunting communities were far more sophisticated than anything we see in other animal species, even today's most intelligent primates. Leadership wasn't determined simply by physical strength or aggression. The most successful hunting groups were led by individuals who combined multiple types of intelligence: strategic thinking to plan complex hunts, social intelligence to manage group dynamics and resolve conflicts, technical knowledge to innovate and improve hunting methods, and perhaps most importantly, the wisdom to know when not to hunt, when the risks outweighed the potential rewards. These leaders faced pressures that would challenge any modern executive or military commander. They had to make life or death decisions based on incomplete information. They had to maintain group morale and discipline under the most stressful conditions imaginable. They had to balance competing demands from different members of their community, from the young hunters eager to prove themselves to the experienced veterans who understood the true dangers involved. The decision to attempt a mammoth hunt was never taken lightly. It required consensus building that could take weeks or even months. Every member of the hunting party had to understand and accept the risks involved. Families had to prepare for the possibility that their loved ones might not return. The entire community had to commit resources to support the hunt, knowing that failure could leave them worse off than before. But when the decision was finally made, the transformation was remarkable. The hunting group became something greater than the sum of its parts. Individual fears and doubts were subsumed into collective purpose. Personal rivalries were set aside in favor of group survival. The ordinary social rules and hierarchies that governed daily life were replaced by the specialized roles and responsibilities demanded by the hunt. The actual departure for a mammoth hunt was a ceremonial event that marked a transition from normal community life to something approaching a sacred mission. The hunters would undergo rituals that prepared them mentally and spiritually for what lay ahead. They would receive blessings from elders and community leaders. They would make promises to family members and take oaths to their fellow hunters. These ceremonies served multiple practical purposes beyond their spiritual significance. They reinforced the bonds between hunting party members and reminded everyone of their specific roles and responsibilities. They created a psychological separation between the everyday world and the dangerous realm they were about to enter. And they provided a formal framework for dealing with the intense emotions surrounding such a high-risk endeavor. The journey to locate suitable mammoth prey could take the hunting party far from their home territory, into regions where they had limited knowledge of the terrain and potential hazards. This travel phase was almost as dangerous as the hunt itself. The hunters had to navigate through territories controlled by other human groups, some friendly, some neutral, and some actively hostile to outsiders. They developed elaborate protocols for moving through contested areas without triggering conflicts that could derail the entire hunting expedition. Scout teams would move ahead of the main party, gathering intelligence about local conditions and negotiating safe passage when necessary. The hunters learned to read the subtle signs that indicated human presence, smoke patterns that revealed the locations of camps, tool marks on trees that showed territorial boundaries, tracks that indicated whether other hunting parties were operating in the area. The mammoth hunters also had to contend with the logistics of extended expeditions that could last for weeks or even months. They needed to carry enough supplies to sustain themselves during the journey, but not so much that they became too burdened to hunt effectively when opportunities arose. This led to innovations in food preservation, equipment design, and resource management that influenced many other aspects of their culture. They developed ultra-lightweight camping gear that could be assembled and disassembled quickly, weapons that served multiple purposes to reduce the total equipment load, food processing techniques that maximize nutrition while minimizing weight and bulk. These innovations weren't just conveniences. They were survival technologies that could determine whether a hunting expedition succeeded or failed before it even located its prey. The psychological challenges of these extended hunting expeditions were enormous. Hunters spent weeks away from their families and communities, never knowing whether they would return home successfully or at all. The constant stress of being in unfamiliar territory, combined with the pressure of knowing that their community's survival might depend on their success, created mental burdens that would break most modern people. They developed coping strategies that helped maintain group morale and individual sanity during these prolonged periods of stress and uncertainty. Storytelling sessions that reinforced group bonds and shared purpose. Competitive games that maintained physical skills while providing psychological relief. Ritual activities that connected the hunters to their spiritual beliefs and cultural identity. The actual tracking phase of a mammoth hunt required skills that bordered on the supernatural by modern standards. Master trackers could follow mammoth sign across any type of terrain, through all weather conditions, and even after significant time had passed since the animals had moved through an area. They could determine not just that mammoths had been present, but how many, what their general health and emotional state had been, and where they were likely to go next. This tracking ability was built on years of intensive observation and practice. The hunters learned to read every type of sign that mammoths left behind, footprints in different types of soil, and how weather affected their visibility over time, broken vegetation, and how to distinguish mammoth damage from that caused by other large animals. Dung analysis that revealed information about the animal's diet, health, and stress levels. But perhaps most remarkably, the expert trackers developed an almost intuitive understanding of mammoth psychology and behavior patterns. They could predict how individual animals would respond to different environmental pressures. They understood the social dynamics within mammoth herds and how to identify animals that were vulnerable to separation from the group. They could anticipate how mammoths would react to the presence of human hunters and plan their approach accordingly. The tracking process often involved following mammoth herds for days or even weeks, waiting for the right opportunity to present itself. The hunters had to remain undetected while staying close enough to monitor their prey's movements and behavior. This required incredible stealth and patience, skills that had to be maintained constantly because a single mistake could alert the mammoths and ruin weeks of careful preparation. During this stalking phase, the hunters were also gathering detailed intelligence about their chosen target. They would identify the specific animal they intended to hunt, usually an older individual that had become separated from the main herd, or a younger mammoth that showed signs of illness or injury. They would study its movement patterns, its feeding habits, and its responses to various stimuli. The selection of the target animal was a crucial decision that could determine the success or failure of the entire hunt. An animal that was too healthy and alert would be extremely difficult to approach and kill. One that was too sick or injured might not provide the meat and materials the hunting party needed. The hunters had to find that sweet spot where the mammoth was vulnerable enough to be hunted successfully, but still valuable enough to justify the enormous risks involved. Once a suitable target was identified and the hunting ground selected, the final phase of preparation began. This was when all the weeks or months of planning, traveling, and stalking came together in a carefully orchestrated series of actions designed to create the perfect hunting scenario. Every member of the hunting party had to understand their role completely, because there would be no time for explanations or corrections once the action began. The hunters would spend their final night before the hunt in intensive preparation rituals. Weapons were checked and rechecked for any flaws or weaknesses. Each hunter would visualize their specific role in the upcoming action, mentally rehearsing every movement and decision. The group would review their emergency protocols and contingency plans for when things went wrong, because experienced hunters knew that something always went wrong. The psychological preparation during this final phase was intense. The hunters had to transform themselves mentally from careful, patient stalkers into aggressive, coordinated killers. They had to overcome the natural human reluctance to engage in mortal combat with an animal 40 times their size. They had to channel their fear into focused aggression and their individual survival instincts into group coordination. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Men who had been joking and relaxing around the campfire just hours before became grim, focused warriors who communicated primarily through glances and gestures. The entire emotional atmosphere of the group changed as they prepared to cross the line from observers to participants in a life or death struggle that would test every skill they had developed and every bond they had forged. Sleep was often impossible during this final night. The hunters would rest as best they could, but their minds were too active and their bodies too charged with adrenaline for true relaxation. They would lie quietly, listening to the night sounds around them and thinking about their families back home. Some would pray to whatever spirits or deities they believed in. Others would simply focus on their breathing and try to maintain the calm, centered state of mind that would be crucial for success in the coming battle. As dawn approached, the final preparations would begin. Weapons were distributed and final equipment checks completed. The hunters would paint their faces and bodies with symbolic designs that served both practical and spiritual purposes. The pigments helped camouflage them against the natural background, while the act of applying them reinforced their transformation from ordinary community members into specialized killing machines. The approach to the mammoth required every skill the hunters had developed. They had to move across potentially miles of open terrain without being detected by an animal whose senses were far superior to their own. They had to coordinate their movements so that they all arrived at their assigned positions simultaneously. They had to adapt to changing wind conditions, unexpected terrain features, and the unpredictable behavior of their enormous prey. This final approach could take hours and required a level of physical and mental discipline that few modern people could sustain. The hunters had to move slowly and carefully, fighting against their natural desire to rush forward and get the dangerous confrontation over with. They had to maintain perfect silence while dealing with the physical discomfort of crawling across rough ground, the mental stress of approaching mortal danger, and the emotional pressure of knowing that their community's survival might depend on their success. The moment when the mammoth finally came into clear view was both exhilarating and terrifying. After weeks or months of preparation, the hunters were finally face to face with their enormous adversary. The reality of what they were about to attempt would hit them with full force. This wasn't a story or a training exercise. This was an 8-ton animal with tusks like spears and the strength to crush a human being without effort. But there was no time for second thoughts or reconsiderations. The hunt had reached the point of no return, and the only way forward was through the coordinated violence that would determine whether the hunters returned home as heroes or whether they returned home at all. The first spear throw was the moment everything changed from careful preparation to deadly chaos. The lead hunter, positioned at the optimal angle to target the mammoth's vulnerable flank, would rise from concealment and launch his weapon with all the strength and precision developed through years of practice. The spear had to be thrown hard enough to penetrate the thick hide and reach vital organs, but the throw also served as a signal to the rest of the hunting party that the battle had begun. The mammoth's reaction was immediate and violent. The sudden pain and shock of the spear strike would cause the massive animal to trumpet in rage and confusion, a sound so loud it could be heard for miles across the open landscape. This wasn't just noise. It was a warning call that could alert other mammoths in the area and draw dangerous scavengers to the scene. The hunters knew they had a limited window of time before their carefully chosen hunting ground became crowded with unwanted complications. But that first spear throw was just the opening move in a deadly chess match that would test every aspect of the hunter's preparation and skill. The mammoth would immediately try to identify the source of the attack, swinging its massive head back and forth, searching for threats with eyes that, while relatively small, were sharp enough to spot human movement at considerable distances. The hunters had to remain hidden while continuing their assault, a challenge that required incredible discipline and coordination. The second and third spears had to follow quickly before the mammoth could fully assess the situation and either flee or charge. These follow-up attacks came from different directions, creating confusion about the number and location of attackers. The hunters understood mammoth psychology well enough to know that the animal's initial response would be to try to identify a single threat it could focus on and eliminate. Multiple attack points from various directions would overwhelm that instinctive response and keep the mammoth off balance. Each spear throw was a calculated risk that could determine the outcome of the entire hunt. A poorly thrown spear might bounce harmlessly off the mammoth's thick hide, wasting precious ammunition and potentially exposing the thrower's position. A spear that struck but failed to penetrate deeply could enrage the animal without significantly weakening it, creating a more dangerous opponent. But a well-placed spear that found its mark could cause serious injury and begin the gradual process of wearing down the massive beast. The hunters had developed different types of spears for different phases of the hunt. Long-distance throwing spears designed for the initial attack were lighter and more aerodynamic, built for accuracy and penetration rather than close combat. Heavier thrusting spears were kept in reserve for the later stages, when the wounded mammoth might need to be finished at close range. Specialized barbed spears were designed to remain embedded in the animal, continuing to cause damage and blood loss even after the initial strike. The mammoth's tusks were its primary weapons, and the hunters had to respect their deadly potential while finding ways to neutralize them. A full-grown mammoth's tusks could be 12 feet long and sharp enough to impale a human with minimal effort. The animal could use them like massive spears, thrusting forward with enough force to pierce through multiple attackers. But the tusks were also limitations that the clever hunters could exploit. Their size and weight made them unwieldy in close combat, and their positioning meant the mammoth had significant blind spots that skilled hunters could use to their advantage. The mammoth's trunk was perhaps an even more dangerous weapon than its tusks. Incredibly strong and surprisingly fast, the trunk could grab a human hunter and crush him instantly, or hurl him through the air with bone-breaking force. The hunters had to stay constantly aware of the trunk's position and reach, moving in patterns that kept them outside its range while still allowing them to deliver effective attacks. But the trunk was also the mammoth's most sensitive and vulnerable feature. A spear thrust that damaged the trunk would cause excruciating pain and significantly hamper the animal's ability to feed and defend itself. The hunters targeted the trunk specifically, knowing that injuries there would be both immediately debilitating and psychologically devastating to the wounded animal. The noise during the active phase of a mammoth hunt was overwhelming. The mammoth's screams of pain and rage mixed with the shouts of the hunters as they coordinated their attacks and warned each other of dangers. The sound of spears striking flesh and bone created a percussion that seemed to shake the very ground. The thunder of the mammoth's feet as it charged, retreated, and spun to face new threats added to the cacophony that could be heard for miles across the landscape. Blood was everywhere within minutes of the first spear strike. The mammoth's thick hide, once penetrated, bled profusely from each wound. The hunters themselves weren't immune to injury. Flying debris from the mammoth's thrashing, glancing blows from its trunk or feet, falls while dodging charges, and even accidents with their own weapons in the chaos of combat all contributed to a scene that was far from the clean, surgical operation that inexperienced observers might imagine. The hunters had to maintain their formation and discipline, even as the situation became increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. The mammoth would try various tactics to escape or retaliate, and the hunting party had to be ready to adapt their strategy in real time. If the mammoth charged in one direction, hunters in that area had to scatter while others moved to attack from the now exposed flanks. If the animal tried to flee, the entire formation had to shift to block escape routes and maintain the attack. Communication during the active hunt was a combination of prearranged signals and instinctive coordination developed through years of training together. The hunters couldn't shout detailed instructions over the noise of the battle, so they relied on hand signals, body language, and an almost telepathic understanding of each other's intentions. A slight gesture could indicate that a hunter was running low on spears. A particular whistle could signal that the mammoth was showing signs of serious weakness. A specific call could warn that other predators were approaching the battle site. The psychological pressure during this phase of the hunt was enormous. Every hunter knew that a single mistake could be fatal, not just for himself, but potentially for his companions as well. A hunter who broke formation or panicked could create an opening that the mammoth could exploit to escape or kill other members of the party. The weight of that responsibility, combined with the immediate physical danger and the exhaustion of intense combat, created stress levels that would overwhelm most modern people. The mammoth's fighting ability remained formidable even after sustaining multiple spear wounds. These animals had evolved to survive in a world filled with predators, and they possessed both the physical tools and the instinctive knowledge to defend themselves effectively. A wounded mammoth was often more dangerous than a healthy one, because pain and fear could drive it to desperate tactics that were harder for the hunters to predict and counter. The animal might suddenly change tactics, abandoning attempts to flee in favor of an all-out assault on its tormentors. A charging mammoth, even a wounded one, was a terrifying sight that could break the nerve of even experienced hunters. 8 tons of muscle, bone, and fury moving at surprising speed toward a human being was enough to trigger every survival instinct that urged immediate flight. The hunters had to overcome these natural responses and maintain their positions and coordination in the face of what appeared to be certain death. The turning point in most successful mammoth hunts came when the accumulated injuries finally began to seriously affect the animal's mobility and strength. Blood loss, muscle damage, and exhaustion would gradually slow the mammoth's movements and reduce the power of its attacks. The hunters watched for specific signs that sound indicated the animal was entering this critical phase. Changes in the sound of its breathing, a slight favoring of one leg over others, a reduction in the speed and force of its trunk movements. When these signs appeared, the hunters would modify their tactics to take advantage of the mammoth's weakening condition. They could move closer and use shorter, more powerful weapons. They could focus their attacks on specific areas to maximize damage. They could begin to position themselves for the final phase of the hunt, when the mammoth would either collapse from its injuries or make a last desperate attempt to escape. But even a dying mammoth remained dangerous until its final breath. The hunters had learned through bitter experience that apparent victory could turn to disaster in seconds if they became overconfident or careless. Animals in their death throes often displayed surprising bursts of strength and aggression that could catch unprepared hunters off guard. The hunting party maintained their discipline and caution until the mammoth was completely motionless and they were certain the threat had ended. The moment when a mammoth finally fell was both triumphant and sobering. The immediate danger was over, but the hunters were exhausted, possibly injured, and now faced with the enormous task of processing 8 tons of meat, hide, and bone before scavengers arrived, or the carcass began to spoil. The celebration was brief because the work was just beginning, and failure to handle this next phase properly could waste all the risks they had taken and efforts they had expended. The first priority was security. A dead mammoth was like a dinner bell for every carnivore within miles. Saber-toothed cats, cave bears, dire wolves, and other predators would be drawn by the smell of blood and the sounds of the hunt. The hunters had to establish a defensive perimeter around their kill and organize watches to detect approaching threats. This wasn't paranoia. Archaeological evidence shows that many successful mammoth kills were lost to scavengers who drove off the human hunters before the carcass could be properly processed. The processing of a mammoth required different skills and tools than the hunt itself. While some members of the party maintained security, others began the complex task of butchering the massive carcass. This wasn't random cutting. It was a precise operation that required detailed knowledge of mammoth anatomy and the most efficient methods for extracting the maximum value from every part of the animal. The hide had to be removed in large sections that could be used for shelter construction or clothing manufacture. The butchers worked with obsidian knives sharp enough to slice through tough mammoth skin, but delicate enough to avoid damaging the valuable fur underneath. The process was physically exhausting and had to be completed quickly before the carcass began to decompose in the heat. The meat was divided into categories based on its intended use and storage requirements. Choice cuts that would be consumed immediately, strips that could be dried into jerky for long-term storage, fat that could be rendered for fuel and waterproofing, organs that contained vital nutrients not available in muscle meat. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death in a world where the next successful hunt was never guaranteed. The bones were treasure troves of raw materials for tool and weapon manufacturing. Mammoth ribs could be shaped into spear shafts or tent poles. The skull could provide the foundation for shelter construction. Smaller bones could be crafted into needles, awls, and cutting implements. The processing required specialized knowledge about which bones were best suited for different purposes and how to extract them without damage. The tusks were perhaps the most valuable materials of all. Mammoth ivory was incredibly durable and could be carved into tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects that would last for generations. A skilled craftsman could turn a single tusk into dozens of specialized implements that would be traded across vast distances. The tusks were also symbols of hunting prowess that conveyed enormous status within the community. But perhaps the most important product of a successful mammoth hunt was the knowledge gained from the experience. Every hunt taught the participants something new about mammoth behavior, hunting tactics, or processing techniques. These lessons were carefully observed, discussed, and passed down to younger hunters who would apply them in future hunts. The mammoth hunters were conducting ongoing research into the most effective methods for bringing down these massive animals, and each successful hunt added to their collective understanding. The social impact of a successful mammoth hunt extended far beyond the immediate hunting party. Word of the kill would spread rapidly through the network of human settlements in the region, carried by traders, travelers, and messengers who moved between communities. Other groups would arrive to trade for meat, hide, and bone, creating temporary gatherings that served multiple social and economic functions. These post-hunt gatherings were opportunities for young people from different communities to meet potential mates. They were venues for sharing information about game movements, weather patterns, and new technologies. They were forums for negotiating trade agreements, settling disputes, and forming alliances that could be crucial for survival during difficult times. The mammoth hunt created ripple effects that influenced the social and political landscape across hundreds of square miles. The psychological transformation of the successful hunters was profound and permanent. They had proven to themselves and their communities that they could overcome seemingly impossible odds through intelligence, cooperation, and courage. This confidence influenced every other aspect of their lives and often elevated them to leadership positions within their communities. The skills they had developed for mammoth hunting were transferable to other challenges, making them valuable resources for their people in many different situations. The failed hunts were equally important for the development of mammoth hunting techniques, though obviously much more costly in human terms. When hunting parties didn't return, or returned with casualties and no kill, the survivors carried crucial information about what hadn't worked and why. These lessons were often more valuable than success stories because they identified specific dangers and tactical errors that could be avoided in future hunts. The mammoth hunters developed elaborate protocols for learning from failure without becoming paralyzed by fear. They analyzed unsuccessful hunts just as carefully as successful ones, identifying the specific factors that had led to disaster and developing countermeasures that could prevent similar failures in the future. This systematic approach to learning from mistakes was one of the key factors that allowed mammoth hunting techniques to improve continuously over generations. The seasonal timing of mammoth hunts created intense pressure on hunting communities to be ready when opportunities arose. The optimal hunting conditions might last only a few weeks out of the entire year, and missing that window could mean waiting 12 months for another chance. This led to year-round preparation and training regimens that kept hunters in peak condition and ready to respond immediately when scouts reported suitable hunting conditions. The mammoth hunters also had to deal with the unpredictable nature of their prey. Mammoth herds didn't follow rigid schedules or predetermined routes. Weather, food availability, predator pressure, and social dynamics within the herds could all influence mammoth behavior in ways that disrupted carefully laid hunting plans. The hunters had to remain flexible and adaptable, ready to modify their strategies based on changing circumstances. This adaptability extended to their tools and weapons as well. The mammoth hunters were constantly experimenting with new designs and techniques, testing different combinations of materials and construction methods to improve their effectiveness. They understood that innovation was essential for survival in a world where their prey was also evolving and adapting to human hunting pressure. The psychological preparation for mammoth hunting began in childhood and continued throughout a hunter's career. Young people grew up hearing stories of great hunts and legendary hunters, absorbing the values and attitudes that would be essential for success in this dangerous profession. They learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite fear. They understood that individual heroics were less important than group coordination, and that the greatest hunters were those who contributed most effectively to team success. The mammoth hunters developed sophisticated rituals and ceremonies that served multiple psychological functions. These practices helped manage the intense stress and fear associated with hunting such dangerous prey. They reinforced group bonds and shared purpose. They provided frameworks for dealing with death and injury when hunts went wrong, and they created spiritual connections between the hunters and their prey that helped them maintain respect for the animals they killed for survival. The legacy of the mammoth hunters extended far beyond their immediate communities and their own lifetimes. The techniques they developed, the social structures they created, and the psychological adaptations they made laid the foundation for many aspects of later human civilization. Their emphasis on planning, coordination, and technological innovation would influence human approaches to challenges for thousands of years to come. The mammoth hunters proved that humans could use intelligence and cooperation to overcome physical limitations and dominate much larger and stronger opponents. This lesson would be applied to every subsequent challenge our species faced as we spread across the planet and began to reshape the world according to our needs and desires. The confidence gained from successfully hunting mammoths gave our ancestors the psychological foundation they needed to attempt even greater challenges and achieve even more remarkable successes. But perhaps most importantly, the mammoth hunters demonstrated that human survival depended not on individual strength or speed, but on our ability to work together toward common goals. They showed that knowledge could be accumulated, preserved, and passed down through generations to create capabilities that far exceeded what any individual could achieve alone. They proved that careful planning and disciplined execution could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The mammoth hunters were our ancestors, and their legacy lives on in every human achievement that requires cooperation, planning, and the courage to attempt what seems impossible. From the moon landings to the internet, to the complex global systems that sustain billions of people today, we can trace direct lines back to those brave individuals who first proved that humans could work together to bring down giants. Their success in bringing down these massive creatures didn't just feed their communities. It fundamentally rewrote the rules of what it meant to be human on this planet. Every successful mammoth hunt sent a message that echoed across the landscape and through time itself. Intelligence could triumph over brute force. Cooperation could overcome individual limitations. And perhaps most importantly, humans were no longer just another prey species struggling to survive in a world dominated by giants. The mammoth hunters became the first humans to truly understand the power of specialization combined with coordination. While other early human groups might have one or two individuals with exceptional tracking skills, the mammoth hunting communities developed entire hierarchies of expertise. There were scouts whose only job was to locate herds and assess their vulnerability. Weapon specialists who devoted their lives to perfecting spear design and manufacturing. Tactical coordinators who could visualize complex battle scenarios and adapt strategies in real time. But perhaps most remarkably, there were the mammoth whisperers. These were individuals who had spent so much time observing mammoth behavior that they could predict individual animal responses with uncanny accuracy. They understood the subtle body language that indicated when a mammoth was about to charge versus when it was preparing to flee. They could read the social dynamics within herds and identify which animals were most likely to become separated from the group. These specialists weren't just skilled observers. They were behavioral scientists who had developed theories about mammoth psychology that wouldn't be matched by modern researchers for thousands of years. They understood that mammoths had complex emotional lives, that they grieved for dead herd members, that they formed lifelong friendships and rivalries, and that they could be manipulated through carefully applied psychological pressure. The mammoth whisperers learned to use this psychological knowledge as a weapon. They would position themselves so that their scent would reach certain members of a herd, knowing exactly how different individuals would react. They understood which mammoths were natural leaders and which were followers, and they could create situations where the leaders would guide their entire herd toward the waiting hunters. This psychological manipulation required patience that modern people would find almost impossible to sustain. A mammoth whisperer might spend weeks slowly conditioning a herd to move in specific directions, making tiny adjustments to their environment that would influence behavior without alerting the animals to human presence. It was mental chess played across vast landscapes with living pieces that could crush a human being without effort. The weapons technology developed by mammoth hunters represented the absolute cutting edge of Stone Age innovation. These weren't crude spears hastily assembled from available materials. They were precision instruments designed through generations of experimentation and refinement. The wooden shafts were selected from specific tree species that had been tested for strength, flexibility, and weight distribution. The wood was seasoned, using techniques that removed moisture while preserving structural integrity. The stone points were works of art that required master craftsmen to create. Each point was knapped using techniques so precise that archaeologists today struggle to replicate them even with modern tools and unlimited time to practice. The shape of each point was optimized for specific purposes. Some were designed to penetrate mammoth hide and cause maximum bleeding. Others were crafted to break apart inside the animal, creating multiple wound channels that were impossible to heal. The binding systems that attached points to shafts were marvels of early engineering. These connections had to be strong enough to survive the tremendous forces generated when a spear struck mammoth bone, but flexible enough to allow the shaft to bend without breaking. The hunters developed adhesives from tree saps and animal proteins that could maintain their strength in all weather conditions. They created wrapping techniques using sinew and plant fibers that distributed stress across the entire connection point. But the real breakthrough was the development of composite spear systems that could be assembled and modified in the field. A single hunter might carry multiple types of points and several different shaft configurations, allowing him to customize his weapons based on changing tactical situations. This modularity meant that hunters could adapt their armament to specific phases of the hunt without being burdened by excessive equipment. The throwing techniques developed by mammoth hunters pushed human athletic performance to levels that would impress modern Olympic athletes. These weren't casual tosses aimed in the general direction of a target. They were precision strikes that had to account for wind speed, target movement, spear trajectory, and the hunter's own position relative to other members of the hunting party. The hunters developed training regimens that built the specific muscle groups and neural pathways required for accurate spear throwing under combat conditions. They practiced not just accuracy, but rapid fire techniques that allowed them to launch multiple spears in quick succession. They learned to throw effectively from various body positions, including prone, kneeling, and while moving at full speed. The psychological training was just as intensive as the physical preparation. Hunters learned to maintain accuracy while experiencing the intense stress and adrenaline surge that accompanied close encounters with enraged mammoths. They practiced making split-second decisions about target selection and attack timing. They developed the mental discipline required to function as part of a coordinated team, even when their individual survival instincts were screaming at them to flee. The mammoth hunters also pioneered techniques for night hunting that wouldn't be seen again until modern special forces operations. They understood that mammoths had different behavioral patterns in darkness, and that carefully planned night attacks could provide significant tactical advantages. The animals were more vulnerable when their vision was limited, and their herd protection instincts were less effective in conditions where they couldn't see approaching threats clearly. Night hunting required completely different skill sets from daytime operations. The hunters had to navigate by sound, smell, and tactile feedback rather than relying primarily on vision. They developed enhanced sensory awareness that allowed them to track mammoth movements in complete darkness. They learned to coordinate their attacks using audio signals that could be heard by other hunters but wouldn't alert their prey. The fire management techniques used in night hunts were particularly sophisticated. The hunters used controlled flames not just for illumination, but as psychological weapons that could panic mammoths and drive them toward waiting spears. They created fire barriers that could channel mammoth movement without providing enough light to reveal hunter positions. They even developed flame arrows that could be shot into mammoth fur, creating moving torches that would terrify the entire herd. The logistics of night hunting expeditions were enormously complex. Everything had to be planned and positioned in advance because there were no opportunities for adjustment once darkness fell. The hunters had to pre-position emergency supplies, backup weapons, and escape routes that could be located by touch alone. They developed elaborate contingency plans for situations where the hunt went wrong and hunters became separated from the group in darkness. The mammoth hunters were also the first humans to develop systematic approaches to battlefield medicine. They understood that hunting injuries were inevitable and that a hunter's survival might depend on immediate medical intervention that could be provided by his companions. This led to the development of emergency treatment techniques that were remarkably advanced for their time. They learned to control bleeding using pressure points and tourniquet techniques that are still used by modern combat medics. They developed field surgery methods for removing spear points and other foreign objects from wounds. They created portable medicine kits containing herbal remedies, surgical tools, and bandaging materials specifically designed for treating hunting injuries. The psychological trauma of mammoth hunting was also addressed through sophisticated support systems. The hunters understood that witnessing violent death, experiencing mortal terror, and inflicting killing wounds could have lasting mental effects that might interfere with future hunting performance. They developed group therapy techniques that helped hunters process traumatic experiences and maintain their psychological readiness for future hunts. These support systems weren't just for the hunters themselves. The families and communities that depended on mammoth hunting success also needed psychological preparation for the reality that their loved ones might not return from these dangerous expeditions. The entire community participated in rituals and ceremonies that helped everyone cope with the stress and uncertainty of depending on such high-risk activities for survival. The mammoth hunters created the first human institutions specifically designed for managing organized violence. These weren't military organizations in the modern sense, but they served similar functions in preparing groups of people to work together in life-threatening situations that required split-second coordination and absolute mutual trust. The command structures developed for mammoth hunts became templates for later human organizations that needed to coordinate complex group activities under pressure. The hunters learned to balance individual initiative with group discipline to maintain unit cohesion while adapting to changing circumstances, and to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information while accepting full responsibility for the consequences. The intelligence gathering networks created by mammoth hunting communities were the ancestors of modern espionage systems. The hunters needed detailed, accurate, and timely information about mammoth movements, competing human groups, environmental conditions, and resource availability across vast territories. This led to the development of spy networks, communication systems, and information analysis techniques that influenced human societies for millennia. The scouts who gathered this intelligence weren't just observers. They were trained agents who could infiltrate other communities, assess potential threats and opportunities, and return with information that could determine the success or failure of major hunting expeditions. They learned to blend into different social groups, to extract information through casual conversation, and to observe without being observed. The mammoth hunters also developed the first human diplomatic corps. Successful hunting required negotiating agreements with other communities about territorial boundaries, resource sharing, and mutual assistance during emergencies. These negotiations required sophisticated understanding of human psychology, group dynamics, and power relationships that went far beyond simple barter and trade. The diplomatic skills developed for these negotiations were transferable to many other situations where human groups needed to resolve conflicts without resorting to violence. The mammoth hunters became mediators, arbitrators, and peacemakers who could prevent resource conflicts from escalating into destructive wars that would weaken all the communities involved. The environmental impact of mammoth hunting was profound and permanent. These early humans weren't just adapting to their environment, They were actively reshaping it through their hunting activities. The removal of mammoths from specific regions had cascading effects on vegetation patterns, water usage, and the behavior of other animal species that had previously been influenced by mammoth presence. The hunters understood these ecological relationships better than most modern environmentalists understand contemporary ecosystems. They could predict how removing mammoths from an area would affect grass growth, tree distribution, and the movements of other prey animals. They used this knowledge strategically, sometimes deliberately eliminating mammoth populations to create better hunting conditions for other species. This ecological engineering required long-term thinking that extended far beyond individual hunting expeditions. The hunters were making decisions that would affect environmental conditions for decades or even centuries into the future. They were essentially conducting continent-scale experiments in ecosystem management, using techniques that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for thousands of years. The mammoth hunters also developed the first human systems for sustainable resource exploitation. They understood that mammoth populations weren't infinite, and that overhunting could eliminate their primary food source entirely. This led to the creation of hunting quotas, territorial restrictions, and conservation practices designed to maintain mammoth populations at levels that could support continued hunting. These conservation systems required sophisticated understanding of population dynamics, reproductive rates, and environmental carrying capacity. The hunters had to balance their immediate needs for food and materials against the long-term survival of the species they depended on. They developed monitoring techniques that allowed them to track mammoth population health and adjust their hunting practices accordingly. The social innovations developed by mammoth hunting communities influenced human civilization in ways that are still visible today. The cooperative work structures, leadership hierarchies, and resource distribution systems created for mammoth hunting became templates for organizing human societies as they grew larger and more complex. The mammoth hunters proved that humans could create social institutions that were greater than the sum of their individual parts. They showed that careful organization and clear role definition could multiply human capabilities exponentially. They demonstrated that trust, cooperation, and shared sacrifice could overcome challenges that would be impossible for individuals to handle alone. The educational systems developed for training mammoth hunters were the ancestors of all formal human education. The hunters understood that their specialized knowledge was too valuable to risk losing and too complex to transmit through casual observation. This led to the creation of structured learning programs that could preserve and transfer crucial survival skills across generations. These educational programs weren't just about technical skills like spear throwing or tracking. They included comprehensive training in human psychology, group dynamics, crisis management, and strategic thinking. The hunters were creating the first human curriculum designed to develop not just individual capabilities, but the ability to function effectively as part of sophisticated team operations. The mammoth hunters also pioneered techniques for accelerated learning that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. They understood that life or death situations created heightened awareness states that could be used to implant knowledge and skills more effectively than conventional teaching methods. They developed training scenarios that simulated the stress and danger of actual hunts, while providing safe environments for learning from mistakes. The record-keeping systems developed by mammoth hunting communities were the precursors to human writing systems. The hunters needed to preserve and transmit complex information about mammoth behavior, environmental conditions, hunting techniques, and community relationships. This led to the development of symbolic representation systems that could encode information in permanent forms. These early information storage systems weren't just practical tools. They were the first human attempts to create knowledge repositories that could preserve important information beyond the limitations of individual human memory. The hunters were laying the groundwork for all subsequent human efforts to create libraries, databases, and information systems that could accumulate knowledge across generations. The mammoth hunters were creating the foundation for human civilization itself. Every successful hunt proved that intelligence, cooperation, and careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Every innovation in hunting technique demonstrated that human capabilities could be improved through systematic effort and creative thinking. Every generation of hunters built on the knowledge of their predecessors, creating an ever-expanding foundation of human achievement. The confidence and capabilities developed through mammoth hunting would eventually be applied to every other challenge humans would face as our species spread across the planet. The same strategic thinking that could bring down an 8-ton mammoth would eventually be used to build cities, create governments, develop technologies, and explore space. The cooperative skills that made mammoth hunting possible would become the basis for all large-scale human enterprises. The mammoth hunters weren't just surviving in their dangerous world, they were proving that humans could dominate any environment through superior intelligence and organization. They were demonstrating that our species possessed capabilities that could overcome any obstacle and achieve any goal that could be imagined and planned for. 3 million years later, as we sit in our climate-controlled homes, ordering food with the touch of a screen and communicating instantly with people on the opposite side of the planet, we are still using the fundamental capabilities that the mammoth hunters first developed. We are still proving that intelligence and cooperation can overcome any challenge, just as our ancestors proved when they first looked at an 8-ton mammoth and decided that impossible was just another word for a problem that hadn't been solved yet. The mammoth hunters weren't just changing their own world, they were fundamentally altering the trajectory of human evolution itself. Every successful hunt created selective pressures that favored individuals with better spatial reasoning, enhanced communication skills, and superior ability to function under extreme stress. The communities that could coordinate mammoth hunts most effectively survived and reproduced at higher rates than those that couldn't master these techniques. This wasn't just cultural evolution, it was biological evolution in real time. The mammoth hunters were literally reshaping the human brain through the demands of their profession. The neural pathways required for complex tactical thinking, the enhanced memory systems needed to retain vast amounts of environmental knowledge, and the emotional regulation capabilities necessary for functioning in life-threatening situations were all being strengthened and refined through the intense selective pressure of mammoth hunting. The children who grew up in these hunting communities were exposed to cognitive challenges that pushed the boundaries of human mental development. They learned to think in 3 dimensions while visualizing complex scenarios involving multiple moving parts. They developed pattern recognition abilities that could detect subtle changes in animal behavior across vast landscapes. They acquired communication skills that allowed them to convey complex tactical information through minimal verbal or visual cues. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to think strategically about problems that extended far beyond their immediate experience. A mammoth hunt required planning that might span months or even years, with hunters having to anticipate scenarios that had never occurred but might determine the difference between success and catastrophe. This kind of long-term strategic thinking was revolutionary for a species that had previously focused primarily on immediate survival needs. The mammoth hunters were also developing the first human systems for managing complex logistics across extended time periods. A major hunting expedition required coordinating the activities of dozens of people, managing supplies and equipment, timing movements to coincide with optimal environmental conditions, and maintaining backup plans for multiple contingencies. These organizational challenges were more complex than anything humans had previously attempted. The solutions they developed for these logistical challenges became templates for all subsequent human attempts to coordinate large-scale group activities. The supply chain management systems they created for supporting hunting expeditions were the ancestors of modern military logistics. The personnel management techniques they developed for organizing hunting parties became the foundation for all later forms of human leadership and administration. The mammoth hunters also pioneered techniques for risk assessment and management that wouldn't be formally recognized by science for thousands of years. They understood that every hunting decision involved trade-offs between potential benefits and possible costs, and they developed systematic methods for evaluating these trade-offs under conditions of uncertainty and incomplete information. These risk management systems weren't just about hunting success. They were about community survival in an environment where a single bad decision could result in the death of multiple community members and the loss of resources that might be impossible to replace. The hunters learned to think probabilistically about outcomes, to prepare for low probability but high impact events, and to maintain multiple contingency plans that could be activated when primary strategies failed. The financial systems developed by mammoth hunting communities were remarkably sophisticated for their technological level. The enormous value of a successful mammoth kill created needs for resource allocation, investment planning, and wealth distribution that required complex economic thinking. The hunters had to decide how to allocate their limited hunting resources across multiple potential targets, how to invest time and energy in long-term preparation versus immediate hunting opportunities, and how to distribute the benefits of successful hunts in ways that maintained community cohesion while rewarding individual contributions. These economic systems included concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized by economists until the modern era. The hunters understood opportunity costs, comparative advantage, risk premiums, and investment returns. They developed currency systems based on hunting contributions, insurance mechanisms for protecting against hunting failures, and credit systems that allowed communities to support hunting expeditions in exchange for shares of future kills. The psychological innovations developed by mammoth hunters were equally advanced. They understood that managing human emotions and motivations was just as important as managing physical resources and tactical coordination. The intense stress, mortal danger, and extended time commitments required for mammoth hunting created psychological challenges that could destroy group cohesion and individual performance if not properly addressed. The hunters developed group therapy techniques that helped individuals process traumatic experiences and maintain psychological readiness for future hunts. They created motivation systems that could sustain morale during extended periods of hardship and uncertainty. They established conflict resolution mechanisms that could maintain group harmony, even when individual interests conflicted with collective needs. These psychological management systems weren't just about hunting efficiency. They were about creating human communities that could function effectively under conditions of extreme stress and danger. The hunters were essentially conducting experiments in applied psychology that revealed fundamental principles about human nature and social organization that remain relevant today. The technological spillovers from mammoth hunting influenced every other aspect of early human life. The precision manufacturing techniques developed for creating hunting weapons were applied to making better tools for food processing, shelter construction, and clothing manufacture. The materials science knowledge gained from working with mammoth bones, hide, and ivory led to innovations in storage containers, transportation equipment, and artistic expression. The mammoth hunters were also the first humans to develop systematic approaches to quality control and performance optimization. They understood that small improvements in weapon design or hunting technique could mean the difference between success and disaster, so they constantly tested and refined their methods. This commitment to continuous improvement created a culture of innovation that accelerated technological development across all areas of human activity. The environmental monitoring systems developed by mammoth hunters were more sophisticated than many modern ecological research programs. The hunters needed to track environmental conditions across vast territories, predict seasonal changes that would affect mammoth behavior, and understand the complex relationships between weather patterns, vegetation growth, and animal movements. This environmental knowledge wasn't just practical information, it was the foundation for humanity's first scientific understanding of natural systems. the hunters were conducting systematic observations, forming hypotheses about natural phenomena, and testing their theories through practical application. They were essentially creating the first human scientific method, even though they wouldn't have recognized it by that name. The communication networks developed by mammoth hunting communities created the first human information superhighways. The hunters needed to share intelligence about mammoth movements, environmental conditions, and hunting opportunities across hundreds or even thousands of miles. This led to the creation of messenger systems, signal networks, and information storage techniques that could preserve and transmit crucial data across vast distances and extended time periods. These communication systems weren't just about hunting coordination. They were about creating connections between human communities that had previously been isolated from each other. The mammoth hunters were building the social networks that would eventually unite scattered human populations into larger cultural and economic systems. The educational innovations pioneered by mammoth hunters created the first human universities. The complex knowledge required for successful mammoth hunting couldn't be transmitted through casual observation or informal mentoring. It required structured learning programs that could systematically transfer sophisticated skills and knowledge from experienced hunters to younger community members. These educational programs included theoretical instruction, practical training, psychological preparation, and ongoing professional development. The hunters understood that learning was a lifelong process and that even experienced hunters needed to continuously update their skills and knowledge to remain effective. They were creating educational institutions that could adapt to changing conditions while preserving essential knowledge across generations. The mammoth hunters also developed the first human systems for managing intellectual property and knowledge transfer. The hunting techniques they developed represented enormous investments of time, effort, and human lives, and they needed mechanisms for protecting this valuable knowledge while still allowing for innovation and improvement. These knowledge management systems included patents and trade secrets, licensing agreements, and technology transfer protocols that allowed hunting communities to share innovations while maintaining competitive advantages. The hunters were essentially creating the first human innovation economy based on the development and application of specialized knowledge. The social welfare systems created by mammoth hunting communities were remarkably advanced for their time. The enormous risks associated with mammoth hunting meant that communities needed mechanisms for supporting the families of hunters who were killed or disabled during hunting expeditions. This led to the development of insurance systems, disability support programs, and survivor benefits that provided social safety nets for community members who couldn't support themselves through hunting activities. These welfare systems weren't just about individual support. They were about maintaining community stability and morale in the face of activities that regularly resulted in death and injury. The hunters understood that people wouldn't be willing to take the enormous risks required for mammoth hunting unless they knew their families would be cared for if something went wrong. The mammoth hunters were also creating the first human systems for managing innovation and technological change. The rapid pace of innovation in hunting techniques created challenges for communities that needed to balance the benefits of new technologies against the risks of abandoning proven methods. The hunters developed processes for testing new innovations, evaluating their effectiveness, and implementing successful changes while maintaining backup capabilities based on older techniques. These innovation management systems included research and development programs, technology assessment protocols, and change management processes that could help communities adapt to new technologies without losing essential capabilities. The hunters were essentially creating the first human institutions dedicated to managing technological progress. The conflict resolution mechanisms developed by mammoth hunting communities were sophisticated diplomatic systems that could prevent resource disputes from escalating into destructive conflicts. The enormous value of mammoth hunting territories and the limited number of suitable hunting grounds created potential for violent conflicts between different human communities. The hunters developed negotiation techniques, mediation processes, and enforcement mechanisms that could resolve these disputes peacefully, while maintaining the territorial boundaries and resource access rights that were essential for community survival. These diplomatic systems weren't just about preventing wars. They were about creating stable international relationships that could support trade, cooperation, and knowledge sharing between different human communities. The mammoth hunters were also pioneering techniques for managing cultural diversity and social integration. Successful hunting communities often included individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, linguistic groups, and cultural traditions who had to work together effectively despite their differences. This required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics that could bridge cultural gaps and create unified group identities. These integration techniques included cultural exchange programs, intermarriage policies, and shared ritual systems that could create common bonds between people from different backgrounds. The hunters were essentially creating the first human melting pot societies that could benefit from diversity while maintaining the social cohesion necessary for complex group activities. The economic theories developed by mammoth hunting communities included sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, resource allocation, and wealth creation that wouldn't be formally recognized by economists until thousands of years later. The hunters understood that successful hunting created wealth that could be invested in future hunting capabilities, traded for resources that weren't available locally, or used to support community members who couldn't participate directly in hunting activities. These economic systems included concepts like capital investment, return on investment, market pricing, and economic growth that became fundamental principles of all subsequent human economic development. The mammoth hunters were creating the first human market economies based on specialization, trade, and wealth accumulation. The mammoth hunters were also developing the first human systems for managing environmental resources on a sustainable basis. They understood that mammoth populations weren't infinite, and that overhunting could eliminate their primary resource base entirely. This led to the creation of conservation programs, hunting quotas, and environmental monitoring systems that could maintain mammoth populations at sustainable levels. These conservation systems weren't just about maintaining hunting opportunities. They were about understanding and managing complex ecological relationships that extended far beyond individual species. The hunters were creating the first human environmental management programs based on scientific understanding of natural systems and long-term planning for resource sustainability. The military innovations pioneered by mammoth hunters influenced human warfare for thousands of years. The weapons, tactics, and organizational structures developed for hunting were easily adapted for conflicts between human communities. The same coordination and tactical thinking that could bring down a mammoth could be devastating when applied to human opponents. So there you have it. 3 million years ago, our ancestors weren't just surviving in a world that should have killed them. They were mastering it. They took on giants that outweighed them 40-1 and won through nothing but intelligence, teamwork, and the kind of raw determination that built everything we know today. Every successful mammoth hunt was a victory that echoed through time, proving that humans could overcome any obstacle through careful planning and absolute trust in each other. The next time you coordinate a project at work, solve a complex problem with friends, or simply work together toward a common goal, remember that you're using the same fundamental capabilities those brave hunters first developed on the African savanna. They didn't just hunt mammoths, they hunted the impossible and made it routine.